Chapter 3. Although she had 1,000 matters to attend to, all pertaining to her new non-paying job with the U.S. Interplan Health and Welfare Department, Dr. Mary Rittersdorf took time off for a personal item. Once more she rode by jet cab to New York and the Fifth Avenue office of Jerry Feld, the producer of the Bunny Hintman show. A week ago, she had given him a batch of the very latest and best CIA scripts which Chuck had written. It was now time to find out if her husband or ex-husband had a chance at the job. If Chuck wouldn't seek better employment on his own, she would. It was her duty, if for no other reason than that she and the children, for the next year at least, would be totally dependent on Chuck's earnings. Let off on the roof field, Mary descended by in-ramp to floor 90, came to the glass door, hesitated, then allowed it to open and entered the outer office, in which Mr. Feld's receptionist, very pretty with much makeup and a rather tight spider silk sweater, sat. Mary felt annoyed at the girl. Just because bras had become passé, did a girl with so pronounced a bosom have to cater to fashion? In this case, practicality dictated a bra, and Mary stood at the desk, feeling herself flushing with disapproval and artificial nipple dilation. It was just too much. Yes, the receptionist said, glancing up through an ornate, stylish monocle. As she met Mary's coldness, her nipples deburgeoned slightly, as if scared into submission, frightened away. "I'd like to see Mr. Feld. I'm Dr. Mary Rittersdorf, and I don't have much time. I have to leave for the Turplin Lunar Base at 3 p.m. New York time." She made her voice as efficient and demanding as she knew how. After a series of bureaucratic actions on the receptionist's part, Mary was sent on in. At his imitation oak desk, no genuine oak had existed for a decade, Jerry Feld sat with a videotape projector deep in his business tasks. "Just a moment, Dr. Rittersdorf." He pointed to a chair. She seated herself, crossed her legs, and lit a cigarette. On the miniature TV screen, Bunny Hintman was doing an act in which he played a German industrialist, wearing a blue double-breasted suit. He was explaining to his board of directors how the new autonomic plows which their cartel was producing could be used for war. 4 plows would guide themselves, at news of hostilities, into a single unit. The unit was not a larger plow, but a missile launcher. In his heavy accent, Bunny explained this, putting it as if it were a great achievement, and Feld chuckled. "I don't have much time, Mr. Feld," Mary said crisply. Reluctantly, Feld stopped the videotape and turned toward her. "I showed Bunny the scripts. He's interested. Your husband's wit is dry, moribund, but it's authentic. It's what once was." "I know all this," Mary said. "I've had to hear his programming scripts for years. He always tried them out on me. She smoked rapidly, feeling tense. Well, do you think Bunny could use them? We're nowhere, Feld said, until your husband sees Bunny. There's no use your... The office door opened and Bunny Hintman entered. This was the first time Mary had seen the famous TV comic in person, and she felt curious. How did he differ from his public image? He was, she decided, a little shorter, quite a bit older than on TV. He had a large bald area, and he looked tired. In fact, in real life, Bunny looked like a worried Central European junk dealer in a rumpled suit, not quite well shaved, thinning hair disarrayed, and, to cap the impression, smoking the shortened remains of a cigar. But his eyes, he had an alert and yet warm quality. She rose and stood facing him. Over TV, the strength of his gaze did not register. This was not mere intelligence on Bunny's part. This was more a perception of she did not know what, and all about Bunny an aura hung, an aura of suffering. His face, his body seemed sought with it. Yes, she thought, that's what shows in his eyes. Memory of pain, pain that took place long ago, but which he has never forgotten, nor will he. He was made, put on this planet to suffer. No wonder he's a great comic. For Bunny, comedy was a struggle, a fighting back against the reality of literal physical pain. It was a reaction, formation of gigantic and effective stature. Bun, Jerry Feld said, "This is Dr. Mary Rittersdorf. Her husband wrote those CIA robot programs I showed you last Thursday." The comic held out his hand. Mary shook hands with him and said, "Mr. Hintman." "Please," the comic said, "that's just my professional name. My real name, the one I was born with, is Lion's Blood Regal. Naturally, I had to change it. Who goes into showbiz calling himself Lion's Blood Regal? You call me Lion's Blood or just Blood. Jur here calls me Le Rig. It's a mark of intimacy," he added, still holding on to her hand. "And if there is anything I like about a woman, it's intimacy." "Le Reg," Feld said, "is your cable address. You've got it mixed up." "That's so." Hintman released Mary's hand. "Well, Frau Dr. Rottenfonger." "Rittersdorf," Mary corrected. "Rottenfonger," Feld said, "is German for rat catcher. Look, Bun, don't make a mistake like that again." "Sorry," the late comic said. "Listen, Frau Dr. Rittelsdorf. Please call me something nice. I can use it. I crave affection from pretty women. It's the small boy in me." He smiled, and yet his face, and especially his eyes, still contained the world-weary pain, the weight of an ancient burden. "I'll hire your husband if I get to see you now and then, if he understands the real reason for the deal, what diplomats call the secret protocols." To Jerry Feld, he said, And you know how my protocols have been bothering me lately. Chuck is in a rundown Connaught on the west coast, Mary said. I'll write the address down. Quickly she took pen and paper and jotted. Tell him you need him. Tell him. But I don't need him, Bunny Hintman said quietly. Mary said with caution, couldn't you see him, Mr. Hintman? Chuck has a unique talent. I'm afraid if no one pushes him. Plucking at his lower lip, Hintman said, you're afraid he won't make use of it, that it'll go a-begging. Yes, she nodded, but it's his talent. It's for him to decide. My husband, Mary said, needs help, and I ought to know, she thought. It's my job to understand people. Chuck is a dependent, infantile type. He must be pushed and led if he's to move at all. Otherwise, he'll rot in that awful little old Connaught he's rented, or throw himself out the window. This, she decided, is the only thing that will save him, although he would be the last to admit it. Eyeing her intently, Hintman said, can I make a side deal with you, Miss Rittersdorf? What kind of side deal? She glanced at Feld. His face was impassive, as if he had withdrawn, turtle-like, from the situation. Just to see you now and then, Hintman said. Not on business. I won't be here. I'm going to work for Turplin. I'll be in the Alf system for months, if not years. She felt panic. Then no job for your hubby, Hintman said. Feld spoke up. When are you leaving, Dr. Rittersdorf? Right away, Mary said, in 4 days. I have to pack my things, arrange for the children to. 4 days, Hintman said meditatively. He continued to eye her up and down. You and your husband are separated, Jerry said. Yes, Mary said. Chuck's already moved out. Have dinner with me tonight, Hintman said, and meanwhile I'll either drop by your husband's Connaught or send someone from my staff. We'll give him a 6 weeks try, get him started doing scripts. Is it a deal? I don't mind having dinner with you, Mary said, but that's all, Hintman said. Just dinner, any restaurant you want, anywhere in the United States. But if more develops, he smiled. After flying back to the West Coast by jet cab, she traveled on the urban monorail into downtown San Francisco and Turplin's branch office, the agency with whom she had dealt regarding her highly desirable new job. Shortly she found herself ascending by elevator. Beside her stood a trim-cut young man, well-dressed, a PR official of Turplin, whose name, as she had got it, was Lawrence McRae. McRae, there's a gang of homeopath reporters waiting, and here's what they'll throw at you. They'll imply and try to get you to confirm that this therapeutic project is a cover-up for Terra's acquisition of the moon Alpha 3 M2. That fundamentally we're there to re-establish a colony, claim it, develop it, then send settlers to it. But it was ours before the war, Mary said. Otherwise, how could it have been used as a hospital base? True, McRae said. They left the elevator, walked down a hall, but no Terran ship has visited it for 25 years, and legally speaking, that terminates our land claim. The moon reverted 5 years ago to political and legal autonomy. However, if we land and re-establish a hospital base with technicians, doctors, therapists, whatever else is needed, we can assert a fresh claim. If the Alphanes haven't, and evidently they haven't, they're still recovering from the war. Of course, that may be it. Or they may have scouted the moon and decided it's not what they want, that the ecology is too foreign to their biology. Here he held a door open, and she entered, finding herself facing seated homeopath reporters, 15 or 16 of them, some with pic cameras. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the lectern, which McRae pointed out. It was equipped with a microphone. McRae, speaking into the mic, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Mary Rittersdorf, the renowned marriage counselor from Marin County, who, as you know, has volunteered her services for this project." A reporter at once said, lazily, "Dr. Rittersdorf, what is this project called?" "Project Psychotic." The other reporters laughed. It was McRae who answered, "Operation 50 Minutes is the working name we've applied to it." "Where do the sickies on the moon go when you catch them?" another reporter asked. "So maybe you sweep them under the rug, is that it?" Mary, speaking into the mic, said, "At first we will be involved in research in order to fathom the situation. We know already that the original patients, at least some of them, and their progeny, are alive. How viable the society they've formed is, we don't pretend to know. I would guess it's not viable at all, except in the bare, literal sense that they do live. We will attempt corrective therapy with those we can. It's the children, of course, that we are most concerned with." "When do you expect to be on Alpha 3 M2, Doctor?" a reporter asked. The pic cameras ground away, whirring like distant flights of birds. "I'd say within 2 weeks," Mary said. "You're not being paid for this, are you, Doctor?" a reporter asked. "No. You're convinced, then, that this is in the public good. It's a cause." "Well," Mary said hesitantly, Terra, then, will benefit by our meddling with this culture of ex-mental hospital patients." The reporter's voice was sleek. Turning to McRae, Mary said, "What should I say?" McRae, into the mic, said, "This is not Dr. Rittersdorf's area. She's a trained psychologist, not a politician. She declines to answer." A reporter, tall, lean, experienced, rose to his feet and said drawlingly, "Has it occurred to Turplin just to leave this moon alone, to treat its culture as you would any other culture, respecting its values and customs?" Haltingly, Mary said, "We don't know enough yet. Perhaps when we know more." She broke off, floundering. "But it's not a subculture," she said. "It has no tradition. It's a society of mentally ill individuals and their offspring that came into existence only 25 years ago. You can't dignify that by comparing it with, say, the Ganymedian or Ionian cultures. What values could mentally ill people develop, and in such a short time? But you said yourself, the reporter purred, that at this point you know nothing about them. For all you know, McRae, speaking into the microphone, said sharply, if they've developed any kind of a stable, viable culture, we'll leave them alone. But that determination is up to experts, such as Dr. Rittersdorf, not to you or to me or the American public. Frankly, we feel there's nothing more potentially explosive than a society in which psychotics dominate, define the values, control the means of communication. Almost anything you want to name can come out of it. A new fanatical religious cult, a paranoid nationalistic state concept, barbaric destructiveness of a manic sort. These possibilities alone justify our investigation of Alpha 3M2. This project is in defense of our own lives and values. The homeopath reporters were silent, evidently convinced by what McRae had said, and certainly Mary agreed. Later, as she and McRae left the room, Mary said, "Was that actually the reason?" Glancing at her, McRae said, "You mean, are we going into Alpha 3M2 because we fear the consequences to us of a mentally deranged social enclave? Because a deranged society as such makes us uneasy? I think either reason is sufficient. Certainly, for you, it ought to be. I'm not supposed to ask." She stared at the young, clean-cut Turplin official. "I'm just supposed to." "You're supposed to do your therapeutic task, and that's it. I don't tell you how to cure sick people. Why should you tell me how to handle a political situation?" He faced her coolly. "However, I'll give you one further purpose for Operation 50 Minutes that you might not have thought of. It's entirely possible that in 25 years a society of mentally ill people may have come up with technological ideas we can use, especially the manics, that most active class." He pressed the elevator button. "I understand they're inventive, as are the paranoids." Mary said, "Does this explain why Tara hasn't sent anyone in there sooner? You wanted to see how their ideas developed." Smiling, McRae waited for the elevator. He did not answer. He looked, she decided, absolutely sure of himself, and that, as far as the knowledge of psychotics went, was a mistake, possibly a grave one. It was almost an hour later, as she was returning to her house in Marin County to resume packing her things, that she realized the basic contradiction in the government's position. First, they were probing into the culture of Alpha 3M2 because they feared it might be lethal, and then they were probing to see if it had developed something of use. Almost a century ago, Freud had showed how spurious such double logic was. In actual fact, each proposition canceled the other. The government simply could not have it both ways. Psychoanalysis had shown that generally, when two mutually contradicting reasons for an act were given, the genuine underlying motive was neither, was a third drive which the person, or in this case a body of governing officials, was unaware of. She wondered what, in this case, was the real motive. In any event, the project for which she had volunteered her services no longer seemed so idealistic, so free of ulterior purpose. Whatever the government's actual motive, she had one clear intuition about it. The motive was a good, hard, selfish one. And in addition, she had one more intuition. She would probably never know what that motive was. She was absorbed in the task of packing her drawer full of sweaters when all at once she realized that she was no longer alone. Two men stood in the doorway. Swiftly she turned, hopped to her feet. "Where is Mr. Rittersdorf?" the older man said. He held out a flat black ID packet. The two men she saw were from her husband's office, from the San Francisco branch of the CIA. "He moved out," she said. "I'll give you his address." "We got a tip," the older man said, "from an unidentified informant that your husband might be planning suicide." "He always is," she said, as she wrote down the address of the miserable hovel in which Chuck now lived. "I wouldn't worry about him. He's chronically ill, but never quite dead." The older CIA man regarded her with bleak hostility. "I understand you and Mr. Rittersdorf are separating." "That's right, if it's any business of yours." She gave him a brief professional smile. "Now, may I continue packing?" "Our office," the CIA man said, "tends to extend a certain protection to its employees. If your husband turns up a suicide, there'll be an investigation to determine to what extent you're involved," he added. "And in view of your status as marital counselor, it might prove embarrassing, don't you agree?" After a pause, Mary said, "Yes, I suppose so." The younger crew-cut CIA man said, "Just consider this an informal warning. Go slow, Miss Rittersdorf. Don't put the pressure on your husband. You understand." His eyes were lifeless, frigid. She nodded and shivered. Meanwhile, the older man said, "If he should show up here, have him call in. He's on a 3-day leave of absence, but we'd like to talk to him." Both men moved from the room to the front door of the house. She returned to her packing, gasping in relief now that the two CIA men had gone. "The CIA isn't going to tell me what to do," she said to herself. "I'll say anything I want to my husband, do anything I want. They're not going to protect you, Chuck," she said to herself as she packed sweater after sweater, pressing them down savagely into the suitcase. "In fact," she said to herself, "it's going to be worse on you because you involved them, So be prepared. Laughing, she thought, "You poor, frightened snick, thinking you had a good idea in intimidating me by sending your coworkers around. You may be frightened of them, but I'm not. They're just stupid, fat-headed cops." As she packed, she toyed with the idea of calling her attorney to tell him of the CIA's pressure tactics. No, she decided, I won't do that now. I'll wait until the divorce action comes up before Judge Irizola, and then I'll give that as evidence. It'll show the sort of life I've been forced to lead, married to such a man, exposed to police harassment constantly, and in helping find him a job. Propositioned. Gleefully, she placed the last sweater on the suitcase, closed it, and with a rapid turn of her fingers, locked it tight. Poor Chuck, she said to herself, you don't stand a chance. Once I get you into court, you'll never know what hit you. You'll be paying out for the rest of your life, as long as you live. Darling, you'll never really be free of me. It'll always cost you something. She began with care to fold her many dresses, packing them into the large trunk with the special hangers. It will cost you, she said to herself, more than you can afford to pay. Chapter 4. The girl in the doorway said in a soft, hesitant voice, I'm Joan Treast. Lord Running Clam said you just moved in here. Her eyes roved. She was looking past Chuck Rittersdorf at the apt. You don't have any of your things moved in yet, do you? Can I help? I can put up curtains and clean the shelves in the kitchen if you want. Chuck said, thanks, but I'm okay. It touched him that the slime mold had done this, rounded up this girl. She was, he decided, not even 20. She wore her hair in one large, massive braid down her back, and it was brown hair, without particular color, really just ordinary hair, and quite white, much too pale, and it seemed to him her neck was a trifle too long. She had no figure at all to speak of, although she was at least slender. Joan Treast wore skin-tight dark pants and slippers and a cotton man's style shirt. As far as he could tell, she had on no bra, as fashion dictated, but her nipples were merely flat, dark circles beneath the white cotton fabric of her shirt. She could not afford, or did not care, to have the currently popular dilation operation. It came to him then that she was poor, possibly a student. Lord Running Clam, she explained, is from Ganymede. He lives across the hall. She smiled slightly. She had, he saw, very fine, small, even white teeth, quite regular, well-formed, almost perfect, in fact. Yes, Chuck said. He flowed in here under the door an hour or so ago. He added, he said he was sending someone, apparently, he thought. Did you really try to kill yourself? After a pause, he shrugged. The slime mold thought so. You did. I can tell even now. I can see it about you. She walked past him and into the act. I'm, a sigh. What kind of sigh? He left the hall door open, went to get his pack of Pall Malls to light up. There all kinds, from those who can move mountains to those who can only. Joan broke in. I have a very meager power, but look. Turning, she raised the lapel of her shirt. See my button, bona fide member of Psi Men, Incorporated of America. She explained, what I can do is, I can make time flow backward in a limited area, say 12 by 9, about the size of your living room, up to a period of 5 minutes. She smiled, and once again he marveled at her teeth. They transformed her face, made it beautiful, as long as she smiled, and she was delightful to behold, and it seemed to Chuck that this told something about her. The quality of beauty arose from within. Inside she was lovely, and he realized that over the years, as she aged, it would gradually work its way outward, influence the surface. By the time she was 30 or 35, she would be radiant. Right now she was still a child. Is that a useful talent? He asked. It has a limited use. Perching on the arm of his archaic Danish-style sofa, she stuck her fingers in the pockets of her tight pants and explained, I work for the Ross Police Department. They rush me to bad traffic accidents, and you'll laugh, but it really works. I turn time back to before the accident. Or if I'm too late, if more than 5 minutes has gone by. Sometimes instead, I can bring back a person who's just died. See, I see, he said. It doesn't pay much. And worse than that, I have to be on call 24 hours of the day. They notify me at my Connaught, and I go by high-speed jet hopper to the spot. See? She turned her head, pointed to her right ear. He saw a small, stubby cylinder embedded in her ear and realized that it was a police receiver. I'm always tuned in. That means I can't be more than a few seconds run from transportation, of course. I can go to restaurants, the theaters, and other people's houses, but, well, he said, maybe you can save my life sometime. He thought if I had jumped, you could have forced me back into existence again. What a great service. I've saved many lives. Joan held out her hand. May I have a cigarette, too? He gave her one, lit it, feeling as usual guilty of his lapse. What do you do? Joan asked, with reluctance, not because it was classified, but because it held so low a status in the ladder of public esteem. He described his job with the CIA. Joan Triest listened intently. Then you help keep our government from falling, she said with a smile of delight. How wonderful. Charmed, he said, thanks. But you do, just think, right this moment, hundreds of simulacra all over the communist world are saying your words, halting people at street corners and in jungles. Her eyes shone. And all I do is help the Ross Police Department. There's a law, Chuck said, which I call Rittersdorf's third law of diminished returns, which states that proportional to how long you hold a job, you imagine that it has progressively less and less importance in the scheme of things. He smiled back at her, the glow in her eyes, the sparkle of white teeth, made smiling easy. He was beginning to forget his burdening, despairing mood of a short while ago. Joan roamed about the Connaught. "Are you going to move a lot of personal things in, or are you going to live just like this? I'll help you decorate it, and Lord Running-Clam will too, to the extent he can. And down the hall there's a molten metal life form from Jupiter called Edgar. He's hibernating these days, but when he comes back to life, he'll want to pitch in. And in the apt to your left, there's a whizzbird from Mars, you know, with the multicolored headdress. It has no hands, but it can move objects by psychokinesis. It'll want to help, except that for today, it's hatching. It's on an egg." "Good," Chuck said. What a polygenetic building. He was a little stunned to hear all this, and Joan said, "On the floor below you is a grebe sloth from Callisto. It's all wound around a three-way floor lamp. That's standard equipment in these Connaughts, circa 1960. It'll wake up as soon as the sun sets. Then it goes out and shops for food. And you already met the slime mold." She puffed vigorously and a trifle inexpertly on her cigarette. "I like this place. You meet all sorts of life forms. Before you, a Venusian moss inhabited this apt. I saved its life once. It had dried out. They've got to keep moist, you know. In the end, this climate here in Marin County was too dry for it. Finally, it moved north to Oregon, where it rains all the time." Turning, she halted and surveyed him. "You look like you've had a lot of trouble." "No real trouble, just the imaginary kind, the avoidable kind," he thought. "Trouble that if I had used my head I never would have become involved with. I never would have married her." "What's your wife's name?" Startled, he said, "Mary." "Don't kill yourself because you've left her," Joan said. "In a few months, or even weeks, you'll feel whole again. Now you feel like one half of an organism that's split apart. Binary fission always hurts. I know because of a protoplasm that used to live here. It suffered every time it split, but it had to split, it had to grow. I guess growth hurts." Going to the picture window, he once more looked down at the footer runnels and the wheels and jet hoppers below. He had come so close. "This isn't a bad place to live," Joan said. "I know I've lived a lot of places. Of course everybody in the Ross Police Department knows the discarded arms," she added candidly. "There's been a lot of trouble here. Petty thefts, fights, even one homicide. It's not a clean place. You can see that. And yet, I believe you ought to stay. You'll have company, especially at night. The non-T life forms that live here begin to circulate, as you'll find out. And Lord Runningclam is a very good friend to have made. He's helped a lot of people. Ganymedians possess what St. Paul called caritas. And remember, Paul said caritas was the greatest of all virtues." She added, "The modern word for it would be empathy, I guess." The Connaught door opened. Chuck turned instantly and saw two men whom he knew quite well, his boss, Jack Elwood, and his co-worker in script writing, Pete Petrie. At the sight of him, both men looked relieved. "Darn it," Elwood said. "We thought we were too late. We stopped by your house, thinking you might be there." Joan Trist said, speaking to Elwood, "I'm from the Ross Police Department. May I see your ID papers, please?" Her voice was cool. Elwood and Petrie showed her their CIA identification briefly, then strolled over to Chuck. "What's the city police doing here?" Elwood asked. "A friend," Chuck said. Elwood shrugged. Obviously, he did not intend to press for details. "Couldn't you've found a better apt for yourself?" He surveyed the room. "This place literally smells." "It's only temporary," Chuck said uncomfortably. "Don't deteriorate," Pete Petrie said. "And your leave, they canceled it. They think you ought to be at work. For your own good. You shouldn't be alone where you can brood." He eyed Joan Trist, clearly wondering if she had interfered with a suicide attempt. No one, however, enlightened him. "So, will you come back to the office with us? There's a hell of a lot to do. You'll be there all night, the way it looks." "Thanks," Chuck said, "but I've got to start moving my things. I need to decorate this apt, to some extent, anyhow." He still wanted to be alone, as much as he appreciated their intentions. It was an instinct to crawl away, to hide himself. It came from the blood. To the two CIA men, Joan Trist said, "I can stay with him for a while, at least, unless I get an emergency call. There's usually one at around 5 o'clock, when the heavy commuter traffic starts, but until—" "Listen," Chuck said brusquely. The three of them turned questioningly toward him. "If someone wants to kill himself," Chuck said, "you can't stop him. Maybe you can delay it. Maybe a psi like Joan here can drag him back. But even if he's delayed, he'll do it. And even if he's brought back, he'll find a way to do it again. So leave me alone." He felt tired. I've got a 4 o'clock appointment with my attorney. I've got many things to do. I can't stand around talking." Looking at his watch, Elwood said, "I'll drive you to your lawyer's. We can just make it." He curtly motioned to Petrie. To Joan, Chuck said, "Maybe I'll see you again, sometime." He felt too weary to care one way or another. "Thanks," he said, vaguely. He did not know precisely what he was thanking her for. With careful emphasis, Joan said, "Lord Running Clam is in his room, and he can pick up your thoughts. If you try to kill yourself again, he'll hear and interfere. So if you intend to do it—" "Okay," Chuck said, "I won't try it here." He went to the door with Elwood and Petrie, one of them on each side of him. Joan followed. As they passed out into the corridor, he saw that the slime mold's door was open. The huge yellow mound undulated slightly in greeting. "Thank you too," Chuck said, half ironically, and then passed on with his 2 co-workers from the CIA. As they drove by wheel to Nat Wilder's office in San Francisco, Jack Elwood said, "This operation, 50 minutes, we've asked to be allowed to include a man in the initial landing party. A routine request, which of course has been honored." He glanced thoughtfully at Chuck. "I think we'll use a simulacrum in this case." Chuck Rittersdorf nodded vacantly. It was standard procedure to use a simulacrum in projects involving potentially hostile factions. The CIA had a low operating budget and did not like to lose its men. In fact, Elwood said, "The simulacrum, it was made for us by G.D. down in Palo Alto, is finished and at our office, if you'd care to view it." He examined a small note pad which he brought from his coat pocket. "Name is Daniel Majeboom, 26 years old, Anglo-Saxon, graduated from Stanford with a master's in poli-sci, taught for 1 year at San Jose State, then joined the CIA. That's what we'll tell the others in the project. Only ourselves will know it's a sim gathering data for us." He concluded, "As yet, we have not decided who to put in as determining guide for Dan Majeboom. Maybe Johnstone." "That fool," Chuck said. "A sim could operate autonomously to some extent, but in an operation of this type, too many decisions were required. Left to itself, Dan Majeboom would quickly reveal itself as a construct. It would walk and talk, but when time arrived for it to decide policy, then a good operator seated in complete safety in Level 1 of the CIA building in San Francisco took control." As they parked the wheel on the roof field of Nat Wilder's office building, Elwood said reflectively, "I was thinking, Chuck, that you might like to handle Danny Johnstone, as you say, isn't the best." Chuck glanced at him, taken by surprise. Why, it's not my job. The CIA had a corps of men trained for simulacra animation. As a favor to you, Elwood said slowly, gazing off into the heavy afternoon airborne traffic that hung like a layer of smoke over the city. So you could be with your wife, so to speak. After a time, Chuck said, "Absolutely no." "Watch her then." "What for?" He felt baffled anger and outrage. "Let's be realistic," Elwood said. "It's obvious to CIA's psych men that you're still in love with her, and we need a full-time operator for Dan Majeboom. Petrie can do your scripts for a week. Take this on, see how you like it. If you don't, then drop it and go back to your scripts. Lord." "You've programmed simulacra for years. You ought to be a natural at remote. I'd make book on it. And you'd be going on the same ship with Mary, landing on Alpha 3 M2 at the same time." "No," Chuck repeated. He opened the door of the wheel, stepped out on the surface of the field. "I'll see you later. Thanks for the ride." "You know," Elwood said, "I could order you to take this remote. I would if I thought it would be in your interest, which it might well be. Here's what I think I'll do. I'll get out your wife's folder from the FBI and go over it. Depending on the kind of person she is," he gestured, "I'll decide on that basis." "What kind of person should she be?" Chuck said. "For me to spy on her out of a CIA simulacrum." Elwood said, "A woman worth your going back to." He shut the door of the wheel. Petrie started up the motor, and the wheel shot up into the late afternoon sky. Chuck stood watching it go. CIA thinking, he said to himself, caustically. "Well, I ought to be used to it by now." But Elwood was right about one thing. He had indeed programmed many simulacra, and with calculatedly persuasive rhetoric. If he took over the remote, he could not only successfully manage Dan Majeboom, or whatever it was called, he could, and this did make him pause, he could transform the simulacrum into a delicately tuned instrument, a machine that guided, beguiled, and yes, even corrupted those around him. He himself could not be that articulate, only in his craft was he masterful. Dan Majeboom, in Chuck's hands, could accomplish a great deal vis-a-vis Mary Rittersdorf, and no one knew that better than his boss, Jack Elwood. No wonder Elwood had suggested it, but it had a potentially sinister quality. It repelled him. He shrank back from it, intuiting its odiousness, and yet he could not simply turn it down out of hand. Things, life itself, existence on Earth, were not that candid. The solution perhaps lay in having someone he could rely on do the remote. Petrie, for instance. Someone who could watch out for his interest. And then he thought, just what are my interests? Reflexively he descended by in-ramp deep in thought, because a new idea, not one suggested by his boss Jack Elwood, had slipped without notice into his mind. He thought, There is one thing that might be accomplished under such circumstances: a CIA simulacrum, with Mary on a distant moon, in another star system entirely, among the psychotic members of a deranged society, something which might pass, given such exceptional circumstances. It was not an idea which he could discuss with anyone. In fact, he found it difficult to express it even to himself. However, it had its advantages over suicide, and he had almost achieved that. Under such circumstances, I could actually manage to kill her, he said to himself, through the CIA construct, or rather General Dynamics construct. Legally, I'd stand a reasonable chance of acquittal, since a simulacrum operated at that distance often functions on its own. Its autonomic circuits often take precedence over the long-range instructions of the remote. Anyhow, it's worth a try. In court, I'll plead that the simulacrum acted on its own, and I can sequester countless technical papers proving that simulacra often do such things. The history of CIA's operations is full of such bunglings at crucial points, and it will be the burden of the prosecution to prove that I gave the instructions to the simulacrum. He came to Nat Wilder's door. It opened, and he passed on in, still deep in thought. It might or might not be a good idea. Certainly its merits were open to debate, on moral grounds alone, if not on merely practical grounds. But in any case, it was the sort of idea that, once entertained, did not tend to go away. Like an idée fixe, it had entered his mind, and once there it stayed, could not be reversed. It was not by any means, even theoretically, a perfect crime. Great suspicion would at once fall on him. The county or state prosecutor, whoever it was, handled such matters as this, would accurately guess very quickly what had transpired. So would the homeopath reporters, among whom were some of the shrewdest minds in the U.S., but suspecting it and proving it were totally different matters, and to some extent he could conceal himself behind the top-secret curtain which continually obscured the activities of the CIA. Between Terra and the Alphane system, it was over 3 light years, an immense distance, certainly far too great a distance, under ordinary circumstances, over which to commit a capital crime. Many a slip of the electromagnetic signal as it passed into and out of hyperspace could, in any case, reasonably be assumed to exist as a constant factor. A defense attorney, if he were any good, could make a damn good case on that point alone, and Nat Wilder was such an attorney.